The rotors of the Apache screamed against the sky blades, carving through a storm that had already grounded every other aircraft. Lightning cracked across the horizon as the massive gunship disappeared into a curtain of gray, flying lower than any sane pilot ever would. On the ground, commanders stared at radar screens, voices hushed, faces drawn tight with fear. No one believed it was possible. The mountains were buried in whiteout conditions, wind shear unpredictable, and visibility near zero. It wasn't just risky, it was suicidal. They had already written off the mission. Experienced pilots had turned back. Extraction plans had been canceled. Everyone believed the stranded platoon in those hills was out of reach. Then the impossible happened. A lone chopper broke formation and climbed into the storm. It wasn't marked for combat. It wasn't even scheduled for flight. Yet it moved with calm precision, each maneuver as exact as clockwork. Somebody was flying it like they had trained for this very moment. Like they knew every gust, every blind corner, every second counted. Radios went silent as everyone watched the dot on the screen edge closer to the danger zone. Whoever was in that cockpit was no ordinary pilot. And when the call sign came through, a name nobody expected, that's when everything changed. Natalie Brooks blended into the background at Clearwater Army Base. At 36, she moved through the corridors like a shadow, polite but distant. Her presence acknowledged only when something technical broke. With her brown hair always tied back and her uniform regulation neat, she looked like anyone else in support staff, maybe even less. Most people knew her title, but not her name. Simulator technician. That was all it said on her badge. She fixed cables, updated systems, calibrated controls for the flight trainers used by young recruits. No one asked where she came from. No one noticed how early she arrived or how late she stayed, and no one ever questioned why she never missed a single system check in 7 years. Her office sat tucked in the back wing of the simulation building, a gray space with buzzing lights and no windows. The desk was bare except for a coffee mug and an old maintenance manual. In the corner, a filing cabinet held her records, and behind her monitor, almost out of sight, leaned a framed photograph that never faced the door. In that photo, a younger version of her stood beside an Apache helicopter. Her flight helmet rested on one hip. Her smile looked real, like she belonged there. But no one saw that side of her anymore. The Natalie they knew didn't speak in briefings. She didn't sit with instructors at lunch. She kept her voice low, her opinions guarded, and her history locked behind a wall of silence. What they didn't see, and what Natalie never told, was what happened after hours. When the building emptied and the overhead lights clicked off, she stayed behind. And once the last door shut, she stepped into the cockpit of the simulator. She powered it up like second nature, fingers on controls, headset in place, eyes scanning the interface. Her hands moved with speed and precision, running combat scenarios that would make most trainees panic. Every emergency, every weather condition, every failure drill. She flew through them all without missing a beat. No hesitation, no visible strain. Then when she was done, she deleted every trace, cleared the flight logs, reset the settings, locked the simulator, walked out as if nothing had happened. No one ever knew. Not the instructors she silently passed in the halls, not the lieutenants she monitored during training, not even the base commander whose office she walked past twice a day. At home she lived with the same discipline. A small apartment sparsely decorated, a bookshelf full of flight manuals, a balcony chair where she read articles on rotor system upgrades and battlefield recovery techniques. Her neighbors only knew her as the quiet woman in 4B. She never raised her voice, never invited anyone over. Paid her rent early, kept to herself. In the bottom drawer of her nightstand, locked and unopened for years, was a small velvet pouch. Inside it lay a pair of metal wings. They were old, polished smooth by time and touch. She hadn't worn them since the day everything changed. But she never let go of them either. Just like she never let go of the cockpit, even if it was now made of screens and code. To most, Natalie Brooks was just a technician. But to anyone watching closely, she was something else entirely. A pilot waiting for a sky. Before she was the quiet technician, no one noticed Natalie Brooks was the name everyone knew. Back then, Clearwater Base buzzed with talk of the young cadet who flew like she had been born inside a helicopter. Her instructors used to say she didn't just operate an Apache, she spoke its language. She had entered flight school with confidence that didn't come from arrogance, but from thousands of hours studying, practicing, and dreaming alongside the best teacher she ever had, her father, Colonel James Brooks was a decorated combat pilot with 3 tours under his belt and a reputation for staying calm in chaos. He wasn't just respected, he was legendary, and to Natalie, he was also dad. He took her to air shows when she was little, let her sit in cockpits, taught her the feel of a good turn by holding her hand on the yoke of a model helicopter they flew in the backyard. By the time she turned 16, she could recite rotor specs and emergency procedures better than most cadets. He never pushed her, but he believed in her completely. When she said she wanted to fly Apaches like him, he didn't flinch. He helped her prepare for the grueling application process and celebrated with her when she was accepted. Natalie entered the program with drive that never dimmed. She studied late, flew early, and soaked up feedback like fuel. Her test scores ranked in the top 2%. Her simulator performances were nearly flawless. Even seasoned pilots paused to watch when she was in the air. It wasn't just talent. It was instinct timing and something harder to define. She could sense the aircraft's balance through her fingertips, anticipate shifts in the wind, and adapt without panic when things went wrong. She was the kind of cadet instructors dreamed of, and most believed she would rise faster than anyone in her class. She wasn't loud about it. She didn't brag, didn't act like she had something to prove. But when she walked onto the flight line in her suit and helmet, people noticed. There was a steadiness in the way she moved, a clarity in her eyes that said she wasn't chasing glory. She just belonged up there. Her father watched every step of her training with quiet pride. He came to her first solo flight standing on the tarmac with arms crossed and a rare smile on his face. When she landed, he didn't say much, just clapped a hand on her shoulder and handed her a flight patch he'd kept from his early days. They weren't a loud family. They didn't talk endlessly about dreams or legacy. But Natalie knew what she meant to him, and she knew she was carrying something important, not just the weight of a name, but the belief that skill, preparation, and calm under pressure were what made a real pilot. At the base, she quickly became a symbol of excellence. Recruits whispered about her performance records. Senior officers nodded when her name was mentioned. Some even said she'd become the youngest instructor in program history once she graduated. She never let it get to her head. She focused on the next challenge, the next simulation, the next procedure to master. She had a routine, a rhythm, a future that felt not just possible, but inevitable. Natalie Brooks was everything the program hoped to produce. Capable, grounded, brilliant. And for a brief shining time, the sky wasn't the limit. It was just home. The storm didn't come all at once. It started with quiet resistance. A cold look here, a passed-over comment there, all from the same senior officer who had been watching Natalie a little too closely since her first solo flight. Major Hadley didn't believe women belonged in combat roles. He never said it outright, but everyone knew. His feedback was sharper, his standards stricter, and his tone more condescending whenever Natalie was in his line of sight. At first, she tried to win him over with performance. She thought if she flew well enough, if she was perfect enough, he would have no choice but to see her as a peer. Instead, the harder she worked, the more he seemed determined to find fault. He didn't care about her test scores or her flawless drills. To him, she was still just a girl in a man's world, and he was waiting for her to slip. The opportunity came during her final qualification test. The weather that day was rough but manageable. Strong crosswinds and scattered rain, nothing she hadn't trained through 100 times. She executed the first leg of the mission cleanly. Her takeoff, navigation, and communication were textbook. But during the weapon systems check, something went wrong. The targeting computer froze mid-sequence. Alarms blinked across the panel. Natalie followed protocol, immediately initiated emergency override, and reported the malfunction to the tower. But Hadley's voice came sharp through the comms, accusing her of panicking. He claimed she'd mishandled the system, pressed the wrong sequence, triggered the error through inexperience. His words cut louder than the static. This is why women shouldn't fly combat aircraft. The phrase landed like a slap broadcast for the entire control tower to hear. She stayed calm, requested a full technical inspection, and landed the Apache safely. The review took 3 days. The report proved her right. The fault was pre-existing, logged in previous maintenance records, but never corrected. She hadn't done anything wrong. But the damage was done. The moment had been public, loud, and soaked in doubt. Hadley's comments had taken root. Even with the truth in writing, whispers spread. Other instructors grew cold. Cadets stopped asking her for tips. Eyes followed her in the hall with new hesitation, as if a question mark now hovered behind her name. Then came the second blow. Her father died in a crash during a routine training flight. The official story said mechanical failure. Nothing suspicious. Just tragedy. But the timing felt cruel. Too close. Too convenient. She wondered if corners had been cut, if he had pushed a failing machine to prove it could still fly. She had no answers, only the ache that hollowed her out. In the fog of grief, she started showing up late. Not by much, just minutes. Her concentration slipped. Her flying stayed sharp, but the spark behind it dulled. Hadley struck again. He filed a report questioning her mental fitness, citing recent losses and emotional instability. He recommended suspension, or at the very least, reevaluation. She was summoned to the base commander's office. The man didn't look her in the eye. He spoke carefully, offering her a way out. A medical discharge, no black marks, citing stress-related complications. A clean exit if she wanted it. It wasn't phrased as punishment, but the message was clear. She could leave quietly, or they'd find a louder way to push her out. She signed the papers in silence. No one stopped her. No one asked her to stay. Her flight suit went into a box. The helmet followed. She packed up the photograph, the flight manuals, the patches and pins. Then she left the base that had once felt like the only home she'd ever needed. There was no send-off, no ceremony, no goodbye from the people who used to cheer her takeoffs. She moved to Austin, took a job logging simulator updates for a civilian contractor. Still near aviation, still useful, but always behind the scenes. She didn't speak to anyone from her class, deleted numbers, avoided reunions, buried that part of herself beneath layers of quiet. Every night she touched the velvet pouch holding her father's wings, but she never opened it. She wasn't ready. The pain was too sharp. The shame, too fresh. The world didn't see a scandal. It saw a promising cadet who couldn't handle the pressure. That's the version that lived on. And Natalie let them believe it, because fighting back meant reopening wounds she barely managed to close. So she disappeared. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until the only part of her that remained was the one nobody saw. Natalie didn't pick Clearwater Base by accident. It was familiar enough to feel steady, but distant enough from her past that no one recognized her name. When she walked in on her first day as a civilian technician, no one looked twice. She wore the same standard polo and khaki slacks as everyone else in her department, her ID badge clipped to her collar like a placeholder. She kept her head down, listened more than she spoke, and never lingered in shared spaces longer than necessary. Her desk was tucked in the far corner of the simulator wing. It had a functional chair, an aging monitor, and a shelf with a few flight manuals, all marked as training references. She never brought anything personal except a mug with a faint eagle logo and a book she rarely opened. No one ever asked about her background. If anyone wondered how she understood the simulator system so thoroughly, they never said it out loud. She fixed things faster than expected, caught glitches others missed, and quietly built a reputation for reliability without stepping outside her role. Every day followed a pattern. She arrived early, ran diagnostics before most lights turned on, and stayed long after others went home. She walked the halls like a ghost, unbothered and unseen. She didn't socialize. Lunch was taken alone, usually at her desk with noise-canceling earbuds and a sandwich wrapped in paper towels. Birthdays and team events came and went. Her name was often left off emails by mistake, and she never corrected anyone. But when the building emptied and the offices darkened, she came alive. The simulator became hers again in the quiet hours when no one watched. She didn't pretend anymore. She climbed into the cockpit, ran advanced training sequences, and let her hands remember. Her muscle memory never faded. She executed combat scenarios with precision most pilots spent years trying to master. The controls responded like old friends. Her breath calmed. Her body settled. And for a few stolen hours, she felt like herself. Then she wiped the logs, reset the system, and erased every trace. Back to silence. Back to a name no one noticed. At home, she lived with the same discipline. Her apartment was small and clean. The furniture was simple and matched in muted tones. The only thing out of place was a steel file box under her bed, locked tight with a faded label. Inside was her past, certificates, photos, a journal with ink-stained corners, and wrapped in cloth her father's pilot wings. She touched them once a week, never longer than a moment. Then she locked them away again. The neighbors knew her as the quiet woman in 4B. She nodded when she passed them, but rarely spoke. She paid her rent early, left no complaints, and rarely turned her lights on past 10. On weekends she read. Not novels, but technical reports, aircraft manuals, and military briefings. She stayed current on everything related to combat aviation, though she hadn't flown anything real in years. Sometimes she wondered why she kept going. Why she kept reading, training, studying. The part of her that still believed she belonged in the sky never fully died. It just folded itself inward and waited. Natalie lived like someone who had accepted exile, but never truly surrendered. Each day looked quiet from the outside, but inside something steady and strong remained. Not hope exactly, not revenge either. Just readiness. A quiet thread pulled taut across years, waiting for tension, waiting for weight, waiting for the moment something would finally give her a reason to fly again. The new simulator program was supposed to revolutionize training. That was the word they kept using. Revolutionary. It would introduce combat scenarios based on recent field reports, push recruits to the edge, and weed out the weak. Natalie reviewed the software package as soon as it landed. Something felt off right away. The enemy behavior trees were inconsistent, and the targeting lag didn't match the real specs for the Apache's onboard systems. She ran diagnostics twice, then again just to be sure. Numbers didn't lie, and these numbers were setting recruits up for failure. She filed a technical note and sent it up the chain. No reply. A week later, she resubmitted it with detailed logs. This time it was returned with a brief comment. Overreach of position. Still, she kept pushing. Quietly. Professionally. She flagged issues in the calibration software, annotated them with timestamps and side-by-side comparisons from field data. The day Commander Walker showed up, the tension in the room shifted. He had the kind of posture that filled a doorway and a tone that didn't invite discussion. His background was naval, but he carried himself like he owned the entire air wing. He didn't introduce himself to Natalie, just looked at her badge, made a sound in his throat, and turned back to the monitor. She stood by as he reviewed the settings she had updated for the new training module. Who authorized these changes? His voice wasn't loud, but the silence afterward made it feel like it echoed. She explained the updates. They were standard, required under the new simulation protocol. He leaned in over her shoulder, adjusted a setting on the screen, and dropped the sensor sensitivity by 30%. That should fix it. You can't train soldiers if the damn thing panics before they do. She tried to respond carefully, reminding him of the specs. He didn't let her finish, just stepped back and smiled without warmth. Stick to your lane, miss. Technician stuff. Wires, light bulbs. Leave the real decisions to people who fly. His words settled heavy in her stomach. She didn't say anything else, just stood there, nodded, and backed out of the room. After that, things got worse. When she submitted more technical notes, they came back unread. When she corrected a glitch manually, she received a formal reprimand. Then came the moment that stuck with her more than any other. A young trainee named Harris had just finished a run in the simulator. The system had glitched mid-sequence, throwing off his timing during an emergency procedure. He walked out pale and rattled. Walker was waiting. He called Harris soft, said real combat wouldn't stop for sensor malfunctions. Natalie couldn't stay quiet. She stepped forward, explained the error in the simulation, the timing discrepancy, the calibration issue. She was steady, respectful, and clear. Walker turned to her slowly. You're the janitor, right? For simulators, I don't take combat advice from someone who never left the ground. There was a chuckle from one of the instructors nearby. Natalie stood still, face blank, throat burning. He called her a janitor, in front of a room full of officers and cadets, and nobody said a word. She went back to her desk and stayed there until long after the lights dimmed. That night, like always, she climbed into the simulator alone, but her hands trembled on the controls. Not because she lacked skill, not because she was afraid of failure, but because for the first time, it didn't feel like enough. She could fly through hell and back in perfect form, and still they would look at her and see someone beneath them. Her name meant nothing, her experience invisible, her warnings brushed aside like noise. And yet she kept going. She adjusted the systems when no one looked, quietly improved the scenarios to reflect real-world physics, protected the cadets in the only way she still could. But every time Walker walked past her without looking, every time a report was returned without comment, The cracks in her restraint deepened. Her patience wasn't endless. Her silence was heavy, and the system she once believed in was starting to rot from the inside. The email sat open on her screen, blank except for the subject line, resignation. Natalie stared at the cursor as it blinked in rhythm like it was daring her to move. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, motionless. She'd had enough. The silence. The disrespect. The weight of being right but powerless. It was starting to feel like the air was too thick to breathe. No one had come to her defense after the janitor remark. No one questioned why every correction she made had been punished. And now, with the new training program rolling out flawed, she could see what was coming next. Recruits were going to be broken by it, misled, trained with the wrong parameters, and it would be her fault by silence, not by mistake. She pushed away from the desk and opened the bottom drawer. The file box inside hadn't been touched in months. She pulled it out slowly, hands steady but heart pounding. Inside, she reached past the old papers and certificates. Her fingers found the velvet pouch. She didn't hesitate this time. She opened it. The wings rested against her palm, cool metal catching the light. Her father's wings, carried through 2 wars, worn with pride, passed down without ceremony the day she flew solo for the first time. She sat there for a long moment, holding them, like they might anchor her back to the version of herself she used to believe in. Her father's voice came back to her in pieces, calm, even, the way he always spoke when a storm was building. Anyone can fly when everything goes right. The real measure is how you fly when everything goes wrong. She closed her eyes and let the words settle. Then she exhaled slowly and laid the wings on the desk. The resignation email stayed on the screen, still untouched. She minimized it and opened a new document instead. She didn't just write a complaint. She wrote the truth. Every calibration error, every design flaw, every risk. She cross-referenced simulator specs with real-world Apache flight data, highlighted failure patterns, included timestamps and trainee performance metrics. She pulled log files from the past 6 months, gathered testimonies, even the ones no one wanted to put in writing, built the case like an engineer, but layered it with the heart of someone who still believed what she did mattered. It wasn't an angry letter. It wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. If she was walking away, she wasn't going quietly without trying to protect the people coming after her. By midnight, the report stretched over 40 pages. Clean, documented, unignorable. She saved it to a secure drive, encrypted and backed up twice. She printed one hard copy and placed it in a folder beside her father's wings. Then she sat back in her chair, exhausted, but clear. The weight on her chest hadn't lifted, but now it had direction. Natalie didn't know if it would make a difference. Maybe they'd bury it. Maybe she'd be fired the moment it crossed the commander's desk. But if that happened, at least she could leave knowing she hadn't folded. She hadn't quit because of fear. She hadn't run to protect her comfort. She had stayed one last time to do the right thing. The cursor on the resignation email still blinked. She moved the mouse, hovered for a second, then hit delete. She shut off her monitor and picked up the wings. As she slipped them back into the pouch, something changed in her posture. A tension eased. Not like the fight was over, but like she remembered what kind of fight it was. She turned off the lights, locked the office, and walked out into the dark lot. The air was cold, the sky clear. Somewhere above her, the stars sat steady as ever, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel small beneath them. She felt ready. The alarm hit just after 9. It wasn't a drill. The red lights along the simulator corridor flashed in a tight pattern, signaling an emergency that had jumped from practice to real. Natalie had barely stood up when voices started shouting across the comms room. A field exercise in the mountain range had gone sideways. A platoon of ground soldiers was pinned between cliffs, caught in a storm that turned from bad to dangerous in less than 10 minutes. The 2 Apaches on support had turned back after the winds nearly flipped them. The storm wasn't just weather. It was a full-blown system collapse. Visibility 0, wind shear ripping through the valleys, freezing rain hammering the ridgelines. No air extraction was possible. Natalie stood in the back, half forgotten by the crowd of officers now crammed around the central monitors. Everyone was talking at once. No one had a solution. Commander Walker paced behind the screens, jaw-locked, arms crossed too tightly. One pilot suggested delaying. Another mentioned trying again at dawn. A medic pointed out that by then the temperature drop would put the stranded soldiers into hypothermia. They didn't have until dawn. She stepped forward, not loud, not bold, just enough to be heard over the tension. There's another way in, a narrow corridor through the western valley. It's dangerous, but not impossible. Heads turned, not toward her, but toward each other, waiting to see who would shut her down first. Walker didn't disappoint. This is an operational command discussion. You're not part of it. She didn't flinch. She pointed at the topographic data on the screen, showed where the ridgeline created a natural windbreak, explained how the Apache's sensor suite could be used to guide a blind entry without relying on visuals. The room paused, not in agreement, but in doubt. She could feel the pushback forming the same as always. Let me demonstrate it in the simulator. Just give me 10 minutes. You'll see what I mean. The base commander exchanged looks with his lead pilot. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then quietly, he nodded. Show us. Natalie moved fast. She loaded terrain data, synced the wind models, and adjusted every dial to match real-time conditions. She didn't hesitate. Her hands knew the system better than anyone. Then she flew. She navigated the corridor with calm precision, called out altitude shifts, adjusted pitch and yaw with each violent wind shift. The screens showed a tight pass through terrain that had looked unmanageable seconds before. By the time she hit the simulated extraction point, the room had gone still. The silence afterward felt like something holding its breath. One of the younger pilots whispered that he didn't think anyone could actually do that in real life. Natalie turned from the seat. I can. There it was. The moment. The twist no one saw coming. It sat there in the air like thunder waiting to crack. Walker stepped forward, laughing once, flat and sharp. You haven't touched an aircraft in how long? You think some late-night simulator runs make you combat ready? She faced him fully. Before I was a technician, I was a pilot. Fully certified. Combat qualified. And I've logged more simulator hours in these conditions than anyone on this base. The commander didn't laugh. He looked at her differently now. Not sure. Not convinced. But listening. You really believe you can do this? Yes. And it's not about belief. It's about skill. I know that flight path. I've flown it in every weather model you can throw at me. Walker tried again. If she failed, it wouldn't just cost her. It would risk aircraft, lives, the kind of mission no one wanted to greenlight without a backup. Then let me go, alone if I have to. But you asked for a way in. I just gave it to you. The silence cracked this time. The commander turned to his staff. Prep an Apache, full extraction load, give her what she needs. Walker's protest didn't land. Orders were already flying. Techs rushed toward the hangar. The storm still raged outside, but inside everything had shifted. Natalie walked toward the flight line like the ground had finally remembered who she was. For the first time in 8 years, she felt the sky calling back, and this time she was ready to answer. The engine roared beneath her like a wild thing trying to break free. Natalie sat in the cockpit of Apache 19, her gloved hands steady on the controls, every motion practiced down to muscle memory. The flight suit hugged her tightly, the helmet a familiar weight she hadn't worn in years. As the bird lifted from the pad, the tower voice cracked in her ear. Weather deteriorating, visibility nearly zero, wind sheer off the charts. She answered with calm precision, requesting manual override on abort criteria. Control granted clearance more in surrender than approval. The moment she cleared the first ridge, the storm swallowed her whole. Wind slammed against the side of the fuselage, kicking the tail like a mule. Her vision narrowed to instruments, every gauge whispering the edge of control. She flew by feel and numbers, altitude pitch, torque trim. No visuals, just raw instinct and the steady rhythm of her breath in the headset. She knew the flight path better than her own street back home. The western corridor was even tighter than in simulation. The terrain rose like a wall on either side, jagged rock and treacherous drop-offs hidden in sheets of ice. Turbulence rolled through in waves, knocking the aircraft off balance again and again. She adjusted with micro-movements. No overcorrection, no panic, just one correction after another like threading a needle in a wind tunnel. Command asked for updates. She gave them in clipped reports, never once sounding unsure. A voice in the control tower muttered that she had to be insane. Major Lewis said she had to be better than that. When she cleared the last blind curve, the extraction zone opened up like a broken promise. Smoke flares lit the snow from below. 20 men huddled behind a rock shelf, their gear covered in frost. She descended slowly, Too fast, and the winds would slam her into the ground. Too slow, and the bird would lose lift. Her focus tunneled into every sound and shift of the aircraft. She hovered just long enough for the first group to scramble inside. No room for all of them. She'd have to make 2 more trips. The cabin door sealed. She lifted banked and turned back through the storm. The return was worse. Icy updrafts shoved against her like fists. The rotors screamed. Her body ached from the strain, shoulders locked, spine burning. But she made it. Each landing tested her limits. Each takeoff pushed her closer to exhaustion. But she kept going. One pass, then another. The last soldier climbed in with numb hands, eyes wide as he stared at the woman flying them through hell. On the final descent back to base, the storm eased just slightly. The wind still tore at the blades, but the horizon cracked open like a window. The airfield lit up through the gray, a long stretch of runway lined with flashing lights and silhouettes waiting. She touched down softer than she expected. The wheels kissed the tarmac. The rotors slowed. The noise faded. She opened the canopy and climbed out. Her legs shook slightly, but she didn't stumble. She pulled off the helmet and let the cold air hit her face. They were all there. Officers, medics, the soldiers she had rescued. Even Walker stood just beyond the group, face-blank, hands clenched at his sides. No one spoke at first. Then the clapping started. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was raw. Real. A platoon of men who knew they owed their lives to someone they hadn't even known existed. One of them reached for her hand. Another saluted. She returned it quietly, eyes scanning the crowd until she found the base commander. He stepped forward, held out his hand, and she shook it without fanfare. His voice was low but steady. You just pulled off the kind of mission most wouldn't even attempt, and you did it alone. She nodded once, still catching her breath. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Behind him, a younger pilot watched her with awe. Natalie caught her gaze and gave the smallest of smiles. The pilot smiled back, wide and speechless. Walker approached slowly, his expression unreadable. When he stopped, he didn't speak right away. Finally, his words came short and flat. That was exceptional flying. She looked at him without anger, without triumph, just truth. I told you I knew what I was doing. He didn't argue, just nodded once and stepped back. Around them, the base buzzed with activity. The storm outside had lifted. The sky above still churned, but the ground felt calm, steady. Natalie stood in the middle of it all, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated. She had flown into the impossible and brought everyone home. And for the first time in years, no one doubted what she was made of. The next morning, the base was quieter. The storm had passed, and with it something heavier had lifted too. Word of what Natalie had done traveled fast, but she stayed away from the noise. Walker submitted a formal request for a review of the entire simulator program. The report she had written weeks earlier was now being circulated at the highest levels. He didn't apologize, but he didn't need to. His silence for once meant something different. Not defiance, not dismissal, just acknowledgement. It was a small shift, but a real one. Natalie stood near the flight line as the rescued platoon prepared for transport. One of the younger soldiers approached her with careful steps. He didn't speak at first, just nodded and pressed a patch into her hand. You brought us home. That was all he said before turning back to his unit. Later that afternoon, the training candidates gathered in the simulator wing. The mood had changed. Instructors now listened more than they talked. And at the front of the group stood a girl barely out of her early 20s. Natalie saw something in her posture, a steadiness that felt familiar. Not loud, not proud, just present, focused. She walked over, reached into her pocket and pulled out the velvet pouch one last time. The girl looked confused as Natalie placed the wings in her hand. They belonged to my father. He flew Apaches in combat before I ever touched a stick. He believed flying wasn't about rank or reputation. It was about bringing everyone home. The girl held the wings like they might break. Her eyes wide, her breath caught somewhere between shock and gratitude. Natalie didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. The sun hung low when she left the hangar. No parade, no speech, just a slow walk across the lot with her duffel slung over one shoulder and a quiet sense that she had finally arrived where she was always meant to be. A junior officer called after her something about interviews and debriefings and press interest. She turned for a second, smiled gently, then kept walking. What mattered had already been done. She didn't want the headlines. She didn't care for medals. Her legacy was written in the breath of 22 men who were still alive and in the steady hands of the next girl who dared to fly. Sometimes the loudest victory is the one you don't claim. It's the one where you walk away knowing you changed the story just by showing up, not with noise, but with proof. And Natalie had done just that, quietly, completely, without asking anyone's permission.